Hello everyone. Okay, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Okay, what we're going to look in this video, it might end up being two, are the final principles of the Constitution. So in the previous couple of lessons and videos, we looked at the principles of things like checks and balances. We've looked at principle of separation of powers. And what we're going to look in this video very quickly, limited government and bipartisanship, which I don't think really is a principle, but there we go. And then we'll look finally at federalism, which is a really important one. Now, in the workbooklet which I put up in front of me, you will notice these two principles have a couple of questions, and you need to use the edXL textbook for these. So, limited government's got 3 or 4 questions. Okay, 3 questions in fact, and bipartisanship has got a couple of questions as well. So what you need to do is to use the textbook to do those. Hopefully this will be reasonably straightforward, he says. Then we've got question 3 here, which is all about this breakdown of bipartisanship. So basically what bipartisanship means is that the founding fathers envisaged that the best way to get things done in America is if the parties and the institutions work together. So laws wouldn't be made in America if things work together. If you end up having 2 groups of people, 2 factions, as the founding fathers call them, who didn't speak to each other and didn't get on with each other, you can very quickly get things like gridlock, where things just do not get passed. Because you can imagine you can have Congress made up of one party, President made up of another party, and if they don't agree on anything, then nothing's going to get passed. And this was the great fear of John Adams, the second US president. He said, "There is nothing which I dread so much as the division of the Republic into 2 great parties." And in many ways, you can say he's right, because at the moment America is very much divided between conservatives and liberals. And we have seen long periods of time where there has been effective gridlock and things haven't been taking shape. When we do about Congress, we'll do about this in more detail. I've got some nice graphs and things to show you. But what I want you to do for this table is so you can find out, just from what we've done about checks and balances, where perhaps divided government, where you've had 2 parties, one in Congress, one in the presidency, or one in the Senate, one in the House, has actually led to checks and balances being more effective, i.e. harder to get things done, I suppose. And then you end to find that perhaps when you have the 2 parties being different, that checks and balances are not as effective, i.e. the president can try and get away with stuff, etc., etc. So you might need to have a bit of a think about that one possibly. But if you could do those for me, then this article in Politics Review, it's a little dated, but the most of it is kind of fine. Again, I'm not going to check you've done these questions, so it's like extra, but I strongly urge you to do it, which basically means do it. So it'll help you with answering questions about limited government, so things like the imperial presidency, how does the Bill of Rights limit government action, really important stuff. For the sake of 20 minutes to read the article and answer the questions, I strongly suggest that you do it, because it will help you with your answers and help develop your thinking on these things. Okay, my main focus today though in this video is going to be on federalism. It's a really important principle. So what I've got a PowerPoint on this explaining what federalism is and how it operates. So without further ado, I will bring up that PowerPoint and I'll talk through federalism and how it actually operates and what the theory of it behind it is in the United States, because it is actually part of limited government. Okay then, so federalism. So this is a map of America, and as you can see, this shows every state with their state flag. What you'll find is every US state's got its own flag. Many of them have got their own state tree and various other things which the states have. Many of them have also got nicknames as well. If you read any of the articles by Larry Sabato on the Crystal Ball sites, just type in his name onto Google, he often refers to them by their nicknames, like the Golden State or the Lone Star State and things like that. Anyhow, right, so I can make it change slide. So federalism is the relationship between the national government, which is the federal government, and each of the individual 50 states. And this comes back to the origins of the Constitution. So if you remember, originally you had these 13 independent states, basically, or semi-independent states who've broken free from Britain. And originally these individual states were almost like sovereign states in themselves, with this very weak national government. The Constitution gave a stronger central government, but gave a lot of power to the individual states. And so federalism is the relationship between the federal government in Washington and the 50 states. And you'll often hear phrases bandied around about things like state rights. That's referring to the rights of the individual states. Sometimes you'll hear things like the federal government's got too big, and that's referring to Washington DC has become far too powerful and is taking away some of those state rights. Each of the individual states has its own culture and identity. They all speak a form of English, I suppose, but they've all got different culture and identity. So, for example, in places like Texas and Wyoming, you've got things like the cattle are really important. You think about ranches, don't you, and cowboys and all that kind of business. It's very different to a state like on the bottom right, which is New York State. And again, you've got these really big cities in some states like New York and Illinois, Chicago and Illinois. And the countryside parts of those states are very different again. So each state has got its own culture and identity, which many Americans are very proud of. They'll tell you, they're from Virginia, USA. They won't always say USA first. They'll often mention the state which they're from. And as I said earlier, each individual state is like a mini version of the national USA. So each state has its own little constitution. Each state has its own elected assembly, often called a parliament, often called a Congress, but not always. Every state has got its own little mini Supreme Court to administer laws passed in that state. And every state has got its own governor who forms the role of the executive. Each of these people, by the way, and institutions are ultimately answerable to the Supreme Constitution of the USA. So the US Supreme Court in Washington can actually strike down any decision made in a state if it contravenes the Constitution. And protecting state rights was an important aim of the Founding Fathers. There's no way it would have been ratified, the Constitution, if the states had not been protected. Also, it's an important feature of limiting government as well, because not only is government limited in Washington DC through things like checks and balances, so the president is limited what he can do, through Congress having the power of the purse and all that kind of stuff, but also is limited by the individual states having their own powers as well. So it's kind of limited in the federal government itself, but also by the individual states. So he cannot always impose his own will across the entire nation, not only because Congress might oppose it, but actually the individual states might also oppose it as well. So again, it's an important feature of limiting government, as well as ensuring the states have their own kind of freedoms, I suppose. And as a consequence of this, because the vast majority of laws passed in the USA are actually passed by state governments, not by the federal government. And in fact, things like the Education Department in Washington, D.C., the Federal Department for Education, is teeny-weeny. It spends virtually nothing, because most of education in the USA is done at a state level. And this leads to big differences between the states. So if you look at things like legalising marijuana, for example, in some US states it's legal to use it for medicinal purposes. They're the ones highlighted on this map in like a light green colour, like Arizona, New Mexico, Montana and stuff. In other states it's legal for use for recreational purposes, as well as medicinal purposes, and they're the ones in dark green. Okay, then in other states it's not legal at all. So you can use marijuana in Colorado for legal purposes or recreational purposes, but if you cross the border into Kansas it will be illegal. So you do get these kind of differences over all sorts of things. I mean, for example, the map on the right hand side is about the death penalty. In some states, you might face the electric chair, although that seems to be going out of fashion. Lethal injection is more popular. A couple of states, the gas chamber. Wyoming has recently reintroduced the firing squad as a potential method. Some states don't have it at all. Other states have it on the statute books but haven't used it for like 30 years or something like that. So again, federalism has allowed these differences between the states. Each state has an awful lot of power. And I suppose what we're going to really focus on is what are these different powers of the states compared to the federal government in Washington, D.C. So, the constitutional powers held by the individual states. Here they are. So according to the US Constitution, they've got the power to administer local, state and federal elections within that state, which is why in some states they allow early voting to take place. So for example, I'm recording this video on the 16th of September 2020. Well, I think it's next week when North Carolina opens the polling stations for early voting. The election's not until November time. In some states, you vote on a computer. In some states, you have to punch a hole in a card. Some states, they've passed laws to make it more difficult for certain groups to get the vote. The Constitution gives the power to the states to administer all these elections. Another important power is that the states are given the power to regulate trade within their state. And as goes with the bottom one, it often links into taxation as well. So an individual state might try to encourage certain industries into their state by perhaps lowering taxation for that particular industry. From memory, I think Iowa tried to entice Microsoft and some other kind of computery type industries by lowering some of the taxes on those industries in the state of Iowa to try and entice Microsoft there instead. The Constitution states that the individual states are responsible for the public's health, welfare and morals within their state. So again, I think this is why Obamacare was quite controversial, because that's kind of the federal government getting involved in healthcare, which should be a state issue, many states argued. Welfare and morals, again, quite vague kind of phrases from the Constitution. And as we said there, taxation. Okay, which is why in some states you pay more taxation than other states. In some states you pay more of one type of tax than another. There's all these differences within each of the individual 50 states. Oh, there's a picture of people voting, just in case you didn't know. There are also these concurrent powers, and what I'm going to do, because I got 15 minutes free on doing a screenshot like this type of video, so I'll do video number 2, part 2 of this, and I'll talk through the concurrent powers and the other ones.